Jean Piaget was a Swiss developmental psychologist and philosopher known for his epistemological studies with children. His theory of cognitive development and epistemological view are together called genetic epistemology. Piaget placed great importance on the education of children. As the director of the International Bureau of Education, he declared in 1934 that only education is capable of saving our societies from possible collapse, whether violent or gradual. Piaget's theory and research influenced several educational practices. His theory of child development is studied in pre-service education programs. Educators continue to incorporate constructivist-based strategies. Piaget created the International Center for Genetic Epistemology in Geneva in 1955 while on the faculty of the University of Geneva and directed the center until his death in 1980. The number of collaborations that its founding made possible, and their impact, ultimately led to the center being referred to in the scholarly literature as Piaget's factory. According to Ernst von Glasersfeld, Jean Piaget was the great pioneer of the constructivist theory of knowing. However, his ideas did not become widely popularized until the 1960s. This then led to the emergence of the study of development as a major subdiscipline in psychology. By the end of the 20th century, Piaget was second only to B.F. Skinner as the most cited psychologist of that era. Personal life. Piaget was born in Neuchâtel, in the Francophone region of Switzerland. He was the oldest son of Arthur Piaget, a professor of medieval literature at the University of Neuchâtel, and Rebecca Jackson. Piaget was a precocious child who developed an interest in biology and the natural world. His early interest in zoology earned him a reputation among those in the field after he had published several articles on mollusks by the age of 15. He was educated at the University of Neuchâtel, and studied briefly at the University of Zurich. During this time, he published 2 philosophical papers that showed the direction of his thinking at the time, but which he later dismissed as adolescent thought. 16. His interest in psychoanalysis, at the time a burgeoning strain of psychology, can also be dated to this period. Piaget moved from Switzerland to Paris, France after his graduation, and he taught at the Grange aux Belles Street School for Boys. The school was run by Alfred Binet, the developer of the Binet intelligence test, and Piaget assisted in the marking of Binet's intelligence tests. Piaget did not focus so much on the fact of the children's answers being wrong, but that young children consistently made types of mistakes that older children and adults did not. This led him to the theory that young children's cognitive processes are inherently different from those of adults. Ultimately, he was to propose a global theory of cognitive developmental stages in which individuals exhibit certain common patterns of cognition in each period of development. In 1921, Piaget returned to Switzerland as director of the Rousseau Institute in Geneva. At this time, the institute was directed by Edouard Claparède. Piaget was familiar with many of Claparède's ideas, including that of the psychological concept, groping, which was closely associated with trials and errors observed in our mental patterns. 17. In 1923, he married Valentine Châtenay. The couple had 3 children, whom Piaget studied from infancy. From 1925 to 1929, Piaget was professor of psychology, sociology, and the philosophy of science at the University of Neuchâtel. 18. In 1929, Jean Piaget accepted the post of director of the International Bureau of Education and remained the head of this international organization until 1968. Every year, he drafted his director's speeches for the IBE Council and for the International Conference on Public Education, in which he explicitly addressed his educational credo. Having taught at the University of Geneva and at the Sorbonne in Paris, in 1964, Piaget was invited to serve as chief consultant at 2 conferences at Cornell University and University of California, Berkeley. The conferences addressed the relationship of cognitive studies and curriculum development and strive to conceive implications of recent investigations of children's cognitive development for curricula. 19. In 1979 he was awarded the Balzan Prize for Social and Political Sciences. He was buried with his family in an unmarked grave in the Cimetière des Oirs in Geneva. This was as per his request. Career history. Harry Baylor described Jean Piaget's theoretical research program as consisting of 4 phases: the sociological model of development, the biological model of intellectual development, the elaboration of the logical model of intellectual development, the study of figurative thought. The resulting theoretical frameworks are sufficiently different from each other that they have been characterized as representing different Piagets. More recently, Jeremy Berman responded to Baylor and called for the addition of a phase before his turn to psychology. The 0th Piaget, Piaget before psychology. Before Piaget became a psychologist, he trained in natural history and philosophy. He received a doctorate in 1918 from the University of Neuchâtel. He then undertook postdoctoral training in Zurich and Paris. The theorist we recognize today only emerged when he moved to Geneva to work for Edouard Claparède as director of research at the Rousseau Institute. In 1922, the sociological model of development Piaget first developed as a psychologist in the 1920s. He investigated the hidden side of children's minds. Piaget proposed that children moved from a position of egocentrism to sociocentrism. For this explanation he combined the use of psychological and clinical methods to create what he called a semi-clinical interview. He began the interview by asking children standardized questions, and depending on how they answered, he would ask them a series of non-standard questions. Piaget was looking for what he called spontaneous conviction, so he often asked questions the children neither expected nor anticipated. In his studies, he noticed there was a gradual progression from intuitive to scientific and socially acceptable responses. Piaget theorized children did this because of the social interaction and the challenge to younger children's ideas by the ideas of those children who were more advanced. This work was used by Alton Mayo as the basis for the famous Hawthorne experiments. For Piaget, it also led to an honorary doctorate from Harvard in 1936. The biological model of intellectual development. In this stage, Piaget believed that the process of thinking and the intellectual development could be regarded as an extension of the biological process of the evolutionary adaptation of the species, which has also 2 ongoing processes: assimilation and accommodation. There is assimilation when a child responds to a new event in a way that is consistent with an existing schema. There is accommodation when a child either modifies an existing schema or forms an entirely new schema to deal with a new object or event. He argued infants were engaging in an act of assimilation when they sucked on everything in their reach. He claimed infants transform all objects into an object to be sucked. The children were assimilating the objects to conform to their own mental structures. Piaget then made the assumption that whenever one transforms the world to meet individual needs or conceptions, one is, in a way, assimilating it. Piaget also observed his children not only assimilating objects to fit their needs, but also modifying some of their mental structures to meet the demands of the environment. This is the second division of adaptation, known as accommodation. To start out, the infants only engaged in primarily reflex actions such as sucking, but not long after, they would pick up objects and put them in their mouths. When they do this, they modify their reflex response to accommodate the external objects into reflex actions. Because the 2 are often in conflict, they provide the impetus for intellectual development. The constant need to balance the 2 triggers intellectual growth. To test his theory, Piaget observed the habits in his own children. The elaboration of the logical model of intellectual development in the model Piaget developed in stage 3 He argued that intelligence develops in a series of stages that are related to age and are progressive because one stage must be accomplished before the next can occur. For each stage of development, the child forms a view of reality for that age period. At the next stage, the child must keep up with earlier level of mental abilities to reconstruct concepts. Piaget conceived intellectual development as an upward expanding spiral in which children must constantly reconstruct the ideas formed at earlier levels with new, higher-order concepts acquired at the next level. It is primarily the third Piaget that was debated by American psychologists when Piaget's ideas were rediscovered in the 1960s. The study of figurative thought. Piaget studied areas of intelligence like perception and memory that aren't entirely logical. Logical concepts are described as being completely reversible because they can always get back to the starting point. The perceptual concepts Piaget studied could not be manipulated. To describe the figurative process, Piaget uses pictures as examples. Pictures can't be separated because contours cannot be separated from the forms they outline. Memory is the same way. It is never completely reversible. During this last period of work, Piaget and his colleague Untitled also published books on perception, memory, and other figurative processes such as learning. Because Piaget's theory is based upon biological maturation and stages, the notion of readiness is important. Readiness concerns when certain information or concepts should be taught. According to Piaget's theory, children should not be taught certain concepts until they reach the appropriate stage of cognitive development.